very pleased to welcome you on behalf of all of our organizers to tonight's event. I'm here with colleagues from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Also joining us our co-organizer, Dr. Shimray, who's representing the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies. She's also director of its Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and also co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Hub at SAS, which might be of interest to some of you. And we're very pleased to be co-organizing as well tonight with the Global Center for Pluralism, some of which is temporarily resident in London for the jury of their esteemed Global Pluralism Award, but which is otherwise based in Ottawa, Canada. The Global Center for Pluralism works to influence perspectives, inform policies, and inspire actions to advance pluralism. And I personally have had the pleasure of working with GCP for many years, and I've seen really the innovation and leadership that they've shown in this area. And so I'm really delighted that we can showcase some of that here in London. I'd particularly like to mention the Global Pluralism Monitor, which is an exciting tool developed by GCP to measure the state of pluralism in a country through a rigorous set of indicators, also including recommendations on promoting pluralism. So I encourage you to have a look at those important reports. And of course, the second initiative is the Global Pluralism Award, which brings folks here today in London. It's a significant platform for recognizing individuals and organizations around the world that are promoting diversity, solidarity, and inclusive societies. And we all know that we need more recognition of that and more support for that kind of work now more than ever. Here at the School of Advanced Study and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, where we have a strong focus on rule of law, human rights, climate change, digital rights, amongst other issues. We also have a long history of supporting research and activism and events around the rights of Indigenous peoples and also minorities. Many of you have been to our previous conferences, book launches, film events, you name it, exhibitions as well. And we're very proud of the work of our research students also in this area. So in just a moment, I'll introduce our chair, who will in turn introduce our speakers. But I'd just like to note that we are planning to record the first part of the event tonight. So we will be able to have a video online of the presentations from our speakers. We also invite you to stay at the end for a reception hosted just down the hallway, and a big thanks to Global Center for Pluralism for generously inviting us and hosting us for that reception. So finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our chair and facilitator tonight, Ms. Meredith Preston McGhie. She provides strategic leadership for the Global Center for Pluralism since joining as their Secretary General in 2019. She represents the center as an ambassador of pluralism to develop strong relationships with community leaders, government, civil society, and other institutions. In previous work, she has devoted more than 20 years to addressing conflict and instability in Africa and Asia, from working with the Naga in Northeast India and indigenous communities in the Thai-Myanmar border to supporting UN efforts in Kosovo, northern Iraq, and several African countries. Her work has straddled frontline negotiation, policy, and diplomacy with leading institutions such as the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and the United Nations in Sudan and South Sudan. So thank you so much, Meredith, for talking us through a fascinating discussion, I'm sure, with our guests tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne, and welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many of you out here this evening after what I understand was a really interesting day of discussions, and so I imagine that you'll have lots of questions and things emerging from the conversations you've had through the day. I just wanted to begin also by saying a really big thank you to our co-hosts and co-organizers tonight, the Institute for Commonwealth Studies, of course, the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies, Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Environmental Humanities Hub at the School of Advanced Study. It's really great to be able to collaborate, and we really appreciate all of you hosting us here tonight. And I do have to say, Corinne, a particular thank you. You have been associated with the Global Center for Pluralism for longer than I have. And your insights and your guidance have really shaped so much of the work that we do. So a huge thank you to you for that, and also for bringing us all together this evening as well. So thank you for that. I was thinking a little bit about where to start tonight, and looking back on several opening remarks that I've been giving for different things. And currently in the global climate that we're in, I struggle to find the language to talk about how bad it is. And I think that there's been a lot of, rising polarization and the rising tide of this, and division and nationalism and all of these things. And we've been saying this at the opening of events over and over again for the last several years. But the level to which it has supercharged, particularly in these last few months, is, I think, leaving us all feeling a sense of shock. Although I am reminded regularly that this is not new, and that a lot of, not just communities living around the world living with this kind of shock daily, but also these are cycles of history. And I've been thinking a lot about what do we do to respond in this moment, because it can feel like it's hard to imagine positive transformational change when things are as bad as they are. And there's an elder from Kitigan-Zibi First Nation, Algonquin Shimray territory, which is the unceded land that we sit on at the Global Center for Pluralism in Ottawa. And Verna talks a lot about scarcity, and about this idea that when you're in spaces of perceived scarcity, people utilize fear. They feel a sense of a need to contract and to protect and to push back against the other. But she also reminds me regularly that generations of lessons tell you that in times of scarcity, you need generosity, you need collaboration, and you need connection, and that's actually how you get through. And so we've been thinking a lot about that in terms of pluralism, that in these moments when we do feel almost assaulted, that rights are being denied and pushed at such velocity right now, that actually stepping back and saying pluralism is this underpinning that helps to keep us centered at a core set of principles that will push us forward. So our center was co-founded by the Government of Canada and His Highness the Aga Khan IV, who some of you may have heard passed away just recently. And His Highness said many extraordinary things about pluralism, but one quote that has been going on in my head recently is this. He said, "Pluralism is no longer simply an asset or a prerequisite for progress and development. It's vital to our existence." And so when I think about how we lean in to figure out how we engage with one another, how we lean in to talk across our differences, to push forward rights and issues that the dominant majority won't want to hear about, but we have to do this in a way that draws everyone into the conversation and create a space where everybody across their differences is able to talk with core respect and dignity. And so that's really what we try to do and utilize pluralism as that tool. We're particularly thrilled, Karen, thank you for mentioning both the Global Pluralism Monitor and the award. We're particularly thrilled that this week we are convening our international jury for the Global Pluralism Award, and particularly pleased that two of our speakers tonight are on the jury, and it is their wise deliberations over these next few days that enable us to identify extraordinary individuals and organizations that are championing pluralism in different ways. So to give you one example, just before I conclude, that was one of our winners from last year, is an Indigenous youth activist network in Oaxaca in Mexico that focus on training and acting as interpreters for Indigenous people in contact with the justice system. And their focus is not only transforming language within the justice system and translating language, but translating the worldview and helping both the justice system to understand the perspectives of Indigenous peoples within the context of the justice system, but to help to transform that system to be responsive to Indigenous peoples in that area. So it's one of many stories that we could share, and I know that our panelists will also be sharing not just about the challenges that we face around the world, but some inspiring stories as well to make sure that we have some hope as we leave tonight. So with those few opening remarks, I did want to introduce our speakers, and then we're going to dive straight into the discussion. Yásnaya Aguilar Gil, to my right, is a linguist, writer, translator, and Indigenous human rights activist from Oaxaca. Very, very happy to have you back with us, Yásnaya. Shimray is the Secretary General for the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, based in Thailand from Nagaland. And Chris Chapman is a researcher and advisor on Indigenous rights at Amnesty International at the International Secretariat here in London. So again, thank you all so much for sharing your time with us tonight. And I think we're going to dive straight in. Gam, I'm going to ask you to kick us off, if you could, to talk a little bit about the situation in Asia among the network of communities and organizations with which you work. AFPP is a network of, am I right, 39 different organizations?
47.
47, God, you gosh. 47 organizations around the region. And I know we've talked a lot about the risks that are being faced in particular in this moment with Indigenous activists and leaders around the region. So maybe you can kick us off with some of the challenges and the risks that you see are being faced.
Thank you, Meredith, and good evening to all of you. Also, thanks for coming to at least listen to us and to have some conversation around these issues that we are facing. Particularly, yes, I agree that pluralism in this case is very important, and it's a conversation that promotes an understanding towards this that's help us to understand and not just maintain differences, but also transcend those differences and find a way to relate with one another. You know? Well, of course, AIPP is quite a large organization. We work in 14 countries, so we define ourselves as a movement of indigenous peoples organization in Asia. Of course, in terms of the situation, it's definitely not very good at this point of time. Actually, it has been deteriorating since the past couple of years, in particular. So we have authoritarian regimes, one party, like China, as you know, and then Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, all these, I'm sure you have an idea about what's happening in these countries, right? And well, the important thing, just to give you an idea, is that, of course, countries like India, the Philippines, they were supposedly championing the democratic values and principles and governance. These are also rapidly regressing and rapidly moving towards authoritarianism. So situation have really is going from bad to worse in all these countries. And you must have heard about Bangladesh. It's under huge pressure from different kinds of intolerance and fundamentalist groups and so on. So the focus is not so much on how to reform with a visionary approach, but rather they're already looking at how and who can become the ruling government and therefore control the power structure and so on. That's more the focus that's happening. Myanmar, as you know, it's in a war situation and is one of the worst, but it has received very, very little attention because the attention is more on the Gaza and Ukraine and so on, but equally severe situation. And most of these territories in Myanmar, by the way, is indigenous territories. No? So we have this kind of very warlike situation, and also this conflict relating to development extractive industries that are taking over resources and displacing communities and grabbing the lands and so on. Well, in terms of the kind of threat, just to give the risk that we face can be, of course, as small as you being under surveillance, to regular small kind of threats, to real serious threats that you get, to, of course, life-threatening situation. And this has even spilled over and actually increased even in spaces like the UN, right? A lot of our activists and friends in the past also, after having spoken in the UN, when they go back, they have been assassinated. And these days as well, the number is increasing. Government delegates are not there to dialogue or not there to listen, but taking videos because all smartphones are available to send it back home, and they face repressals once they go back and so on. So these kind of things are really increasing. In the past few years, EIBP does not maintain systematic documentation because sometimes we are not able to do even though we want to do. But in the last about 3 years, EIBP itself alone documented more than 500 cases of human rights violations. And we are not trying to come out statistics of these things, but we are only trying to, these are cases that we have supported, and those people who are in the last mile, sort of who are unreachable kind of thing. So some form of support that we have given. It's mostly this kind of cases. So that gives you the tip of the iceberg in terms of the risk and the threat and the challenges that indigenous rights defenders are going through in particular. And there are cases like where I come from. It's been decades now that we have laws that empowers armed forces which can allow giving you the right to kill based on mere suspicion, right? And so suspicion can be anything. So that's how threatening it can also be. Of course, this is called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and it has its origin actually during the British colonial India time to quell the Quit India movement. So it was an ordinance at that time. So this has been introduced by the government of India since 1958. And thousands have been killed. We don't know how many have been killed because we are not able to document all those things. But it runs beyond 100,000 kind of figures that we're looking at. So this kind of situation still prevails and is still going on, right? That's the so various intensity that you will see. I hope that doesn't sound too dark. So that's the kind of situation that we are going through. It's very hard to name any country where things look a bit bright. But of course, we operate from Thailand. Thailand, in a sense, is relatively or comparatively a more tolerant society, but it is also a nominal democracy. So we are not able to actually look at any or point out any democratic country that we can say for sure in Asia. No? So the situation in general for everyone. So for indigenous peoples, even in Thailand, it's not good. Malaysia is relatively, comparatively a bit more peaceful or less violent. But even there, the situation is very challenging because they are facing a lot of displacement, and also all these companies, especially palm oil plantations and so on. So even in such countries, situation is actually not very good for indigenous defenders. I hope that should do for now, I think.
You painted a wonderfully bleak picture for us to start, so thank you for that. But Yásnaya, I might turn to you also for a bit of inspiration, if you can start by giving us just some stories of leadership that you're seeing, particularly around environmental issues, where you're seeing inspiring leadership from Indigenous activists who are pushing for a recognition of the climate catastrophe, but also on response to that. And I think you wanted to talk a bit also about the intersection between culture and environmental rights.
Thank you. I would like to thank to all the people involved in the organization of this roundtable. I also to thank to the University of London, to the Global Center for Pluralism, Thank you for organizing this in these times when it's so important to encourage conversations and pluralism more than ever, I think. And first of all, I want to tell you a story. After the beginning, the colonization, indigenous people make up 6% of the global population. It was not always like this. For example, in Mexico, in the 2 centuries ago, it was estimated that about 70% of the country's population was indigenous. Something happened. Indigenous, at the present, indigenous people manage almost half of the Earth's protected areas and a significant portion of the planet's most ecological intact landscapes. At this time when humanity is facing one of the greatest challenges in history, climate crisis, it's important to say that indigenous people have some keys to face this crisis because we have experience in crisis, like colonizations. And I want to, I find inspiration in our culture. And I think culture is very important because we have different tradition of thoughts with keys, very important keys. And I think that in the Western tradition of thought, the division between nature and culture is very important. In hegemonic languages, we use nature as something different from humanity or from humankind. Let me use a metaphor. I love metaphors. I am a linguist, so let us think that reality or the universe is our body. And let us think that humanity is just a hand of that entire body. And we cut off the hand, conceptually speaking, and we separate it from the rest of the body. This is a primordial violence in this separation. In this tradition, humanity is something separate from natura, and nature and humankind are placed in a hierarchy. Humanity is more important. For example, in the Bible, God said to Adam that he's more important than nature, than creatures of natures. So this is how nature can become a natural resource, not a common good. For example, for indigenous people, nature is common good, it's a natural good. But in capitalism, nature is just commodity. For example, in my language, Mije, it's an indigenous language from Mexico, and in other indigenous languages, humanity and nature are not radically separated. We use, in my language, a word is et, and et is describe reality, universe. It is both noun and verb. As a verb, it means to be, to exist. And as a noun, all that is, everything that has existence. In this tradition, humanity is a part of the it. There is no word for nature. Nature like something different from humanity. And Mije can say just nature or something different. Aura Gomez, it's a very important anthropologist. She is from Guatemala. She is Cachiquel. Says that the notion of balance or equilibrium is very important from indigenous people. And our languages reflect that. For example, in Mije, we use hotkwak, and hotkwak means to have balance, and it's for people who is happy. It's like it's very different from developing or progress. It's about to have a good life with rights and with happiness, but in a more holistic meaning. So in opposition, in capitalism, in English and hegemonic languages, progress, notions like progress, development are very important, but it's very different from hot cook. These notions like progress, development, imply to be always growing, always moving away from the balance, from the center, from the equilibrium, growing out of control without limit, like cancer. So in the opposite, we have equilibrium and balance. And in our tradition of thinking, balance, not development, not progress, is what is important. So we, as humankind, need to work in or to recuperate equilibrium. And it's for the Western tradition, reason and logic are very important. But now, in these days with climate crisis, something very irrational is being done. Trying to grow economically to infinite on a planet that is finite, has in a planet that has limits, it's a paradox. And I am very interested in this paradox. Why? Why Western culture is so obsessed with logic, with ration, but it's doing something very irrational. So I think that it's very important to recreate or build another leadership based on equilibrium, not development, not just development. And I think that since indigenous people are producing just 10% of the greenhouse gases, we need to establish partnership in equilibrium with other cultures. So I think our cultures, there are many different words in different languages, indigenous languages, to name equilibrium. It's like sumakausai, it's like hotkukrot, many different words in opposite to development and progress. And I think we need to build a new leadership or new concept of leadership based on reciprocity, in pluralism. And there are also many different words in different languages in the world for name this reciprocity, like or working together, like Ubuntu, like Kol, Tekyo, many different tradition of thoughts. So I think that protect our languages and our cultures is protecting different tradition of thoughts with the necessary keys to facing this very important challenge as the climate crisis is.
You know, listening to you reminds me so much that one of the things that we need to, in all of our communities and all of our spaces, do is help people to think about how we reframe these issues and reframe the problem. And rather than reacting to things, centering around what it is that we're trying to be as a planet, creates a different kind of conversation when you start with the sentiments that you've described. And I think I often hear similar expressions from Indigenous colleagues in Colombia and in different places. And I think it's figuring out how to help non-Indigenous communities actually understand and figure out how to embrace that as well, which might lead me to Chris. Because I was hoping you could talk a bit about allies and strategies for allyship within this space, for partnership, and how we sort of widen this space out to start bringing some of these actions forward.
Thank you, Meredith, and also wanted to thank the organisers for this event, and for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for coming and patiently listening after such a long day of listening to of your conference. So when I saw this question about allyship, I thought, okay, Amnesty is the wrong organisation to talk about this. We're always talking about how internally in Amnesty about how bad we are at allying with other organisations, partly because we have ridiculous processes, because we're big and we're a bureaucracy. So we have ridiculous processes around getting things approved, getting statements approved. So quite often people go, it's just too complex, let's just make our own statement. So I was thinking, don't ask me about allyship, but then I was thinking about a project I was involved in 2014 to 2018, which was a piece of research on the Emberwood forest in Kenya, where the Sengwer were being evicted over a period of decades in order to make way for a protected forest. And we worked with them on their rights to their land in the forest. We published a report, and we were working with our section in Kenya, and there was a woman in the section called Naomi Barasa, who's just an inspiration for me. And she came from a community organising background. She'd worked in the slums in Nairobi, organising around forced evictions of slum dwellers when slums were being razed to the ground. And she worked with the Sengwer, and they came up with this idea to organise this walk for justice, where they gathered up petitions, and then the petitions came through Amnesty's Right for Rights programme, which some people may know is one of the famous things that Amnesty is known for, writing letters. But we collected hundreds and tens of thousands of signatures to ask the government to respect the land rights of the Sengwer. So they took all of these signatures and they walked from their forest to Nairobi, and they formed a coalition with the Kenya Peasants League, with the Ogyek and other indigenous people suffering very similar issues, the Enderoys also suffering very similar issues in Kenya with forced evictions, and they organised this march to the capital, and it was a really beautiful event, and it was a big success in terms of attracting attention, media attention to the campaign. And it was a real inspiration for me. It made me think this is how we need to organise. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier about how in times of crisis, in times of scarcity, actually people need to work together. And this happens spontaneously. Like, it's actually in times of excess when people start going back into themselves and thinking, no, I'm just going to look after what I've got. And not bothering to think about solidarity. In times of scarcity, people realise that they depend on each other. And I think that was what we saw in Kenya, was that these different communities, each of these communities have their own struggles, but they were willing to join in that struggle, to help the Sengwer in their fight, and knowing that in the future the Sengwer would also show solidarity with their fight, no doubt, when they needed it. So it was really an inspiration for me. It also takes me on to thinking about another thing, because I was thinking about the risks and some of the subjects that we're talking about in this event, and what Gam was talking about, the risks that Indigenous peoples are facing. One of the risks that we see a lot in our work is what has come to be known as by this amazing name of SLAP suits. SLAP with a double P. Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. It's a terrible acronym actually, but the word SLAP is actually fitting. SLAP is great. Like that's why you don't want to spell it out. The actual word is great. These are when companies or governments want to suppress activism basically by tying people up in lawsuits. So they'll accuse people of, like if you have a fight against a company, you're protesting against what a company is doing, they'll accuse you of defamation of the company. And they'll take you to court. And sometimes they know perfectly well they're not going to win, but the point is to tie you up in these lawsuits, and it's very expensive. You have to spend a lot of money hiring a lawyer, and it takes a lot of time, and it distracts you from the fight. And that's they've got plenty of money, so they can throw money into this. And it was making me think about, there's a case going on right now in America where Greenpeace USA is being taken to court by Energy Transfer, which is the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. They accused Greenpeace USA of orchestrating the Dakota Access protests, which is extraordinary. Like, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests were spontaneously organized by indigenous peoples affected by the pipeline. And there was a huge movement where people came from all over in solidarity to support the indigenous peoples who were protesting against the pipeline, including Greenpeace, who also mobilized. So again, this was solidarity in action. But the company can't see it as solidarity. They have to think, oh, there must be somebody behind this orchestrating this. It can't just be people spontaneously helping each other out. It must be some nasty plan, cooked up by these Greenpeace people in their office in Washington to organize these protests. So I'm sure as well there's a lot of bad faith in what they're doing. They probably know perfectly well it was spontaneous. But there's a lot of, they want to characterize it as something that was cooked up in Washington. So there is this idea that we have to always think that people don't want to believe in altruistic behavior anymore. There's always got to be this idea that, oh no, Greenpeace are thinking about getting more members and getting more money coming in, so they're going to cook up this idea of having this protest. So there's this almost a conspiracy to get people to not have faith in the idea of altruism anymore. Altruism and solidarity, which is really important.
And I think there's some phenomenal examples. Your Kenya example is wonderful of how these moments can actually bring that solidarity together. I know that the peace process in Colombia leading to the 2016 agreement is a great example of a lot of national solidarity across Indigenous, Afro-Colombian, and other groups together. Just before we kick it off for questions from the audience, I wonder, both Gam and Yásnaya, if you wanted to reflect a little bit on these ideas of solidarity and allyship, especially at a moment where the ideas of activism are coming under threat in countries where often we assumed that there were allies who could speak freely even when we couldn't. So you think about organizations that might be in Denmark, IFGIA being one I'm thinking of, but many that would speak out on behalf of or speak out on an issue in a way in Canada, in the United States, and so forth, where you're seeing a lot of that speech now starting to contract. You're seeing less interest in aid support to organizations on Indigenous rights in Asia, for example, and so forth. So maybe if you could reflect a little bit on how you see that question of solidarity right now, not just across the region, but for others outside of Asia that you've worked with before and sort of counted on support to raise these issues, particularly given the risks that you described.
Yeah, for AIBP, of course, this issue of solidarity has always been very, very important because our work is to link from the local to the regional to the global, and how we can leverage and build networks and solidarity and so on. But of course, very challenging. Solidarity doesn't always appear to be as easy as it sounds. Often you have to be strategic, you have to put in a lot of effort, and of course, sometimes we don't put in enough effort because you have your own burning issue on the ground, right? If your house is on fire, then you're trying to save life about your own people. So it's very definitely challenging. You have your own situation. So you often try to regress back to the whole issue of your own issues. But yet we try to continue to push. So success of solidarity, I would not also just blame it on other people alone, but we have our own limitations. As I'm describing it, we have to attend to when your house is on fire. You have to, go back to the emergency situation. You don't have other means and ways to do enough. But yes, in this linkage process, definitely our global allies, for instance, has really helped. Of course, the one that you mentioned, IFGIA, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs. I think they are the oldest international organization dedicated to addressing and supporting indigenous organizations. Somewhere around 1968, they've been in existence. So, and of course, they have done a lot of job, great job, and it was through them that we were able to also see some new hope, some inspiration as well, and also having the opportunity to be able to connect with more and more organizations. And in that process, we have met with amazing people and organizations. Of course, Amnesty also one. Sometimes it moves, kind of slides up and down a little bit, but I think that's quite normal in any movement and in the kind of work we're doing. But like the militarized situation I was describing to you about these armed forces having the right to shoot to kill, for example, Amnesty definitely also was one of the first to bring about this kind of global campaign. And that kind of global campaign, of course, not just that aspect, but many others linked to this whole issue of solidarity networking, leading to pressurizing. For example, my people are in peace negotiation at the moment with the government of India. Regardless of where that is heading is another thing, but what I'm essentially trying to point to is that that kind of networking and solidarity was absolutely very essential in pressurizing the government of India to get into a political negotiation, to move away from this whole narrative of the government of India's position that these are internal law and order issues, to recognizing that these are political issues that needs to be negotiated and settled, right? So these kind of things. So of course EIDP does a lot. I have been also been many part of it. Like the Convention on Biological Diversity as well. Now, where there used to be an ad hoc working group on Article AJ, they call it, that's on traditional knowledge. It has now, they have decided to form a working group on indigenous knowledge on a more permanent basis, for example. These are decades of advocacy with a number of partners and allies, whether it's from international organization or specific countries that sometimes bilateral approach that we try to campaign with Norwegian government or the Danish government and so on. So, of course, many layers, but essentially the point is that it has been absolutely very, very useful in this. And in the very dark image that I have painted about Asia, I still think, in spite of all those, I try to convince my colleagues still that if the UN was not there, and if this international solidarity, however difficult, was not there, our situations would still have been far worse than what we are experiencing, right? So it's not just an outcome of a very, I don't know how to describe, actually my brain is not firing this evening. But let's say, something that fruits into something that is really good, right? It's not always like that we count solidarity to be that's not the measurement alone. Right now, the situation that we're going through, I'm sure that if we did not have this solidarity and the presence of UN, even if the UN is less effective at the moment, still their intervention has helped, whether it's the Human Rights Council or the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples or the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. Their writings and interventions have helped, right? So it has prevented, I think, many potential other conflicts in many ways. Even now, so we don't give up. Right now, for example, which is still not yet very popular, but there's something in the UN going on as enhanced participation of indigenous peoples. Yeah, it's a diplomatic term, enhanced participation. Actually, this is a fight for our right to be recognized as a people in the UN system, right? The UN declaration is there, but in terms of the way we participate, we only participate as NGOs with ECOSOC status. Here, surprisingly, there are governments who are beginning to support this idea a lot. Of course, many views will be there, different positions. As expected, of course, a lot of the southern countries, Asian governments, they will insist on recognition in order that you are able to have a different new status in the UN. Of course, ideally, so far, for example, what we are demanding is that we also be recognized and allowed to participate in all the UN processes with the status that observers states have, so that we can directly at least table your issues in writings or whenever you can to even negotiate directly face-to-face with governments. Because as NGOs, we can only so far give recommendations, and recommendations are piling up and no actions behind those thousands of recommendations that are already there, right? Now, for example, that's why I'm saying that it is only through solidarity, and we continue to lobby with whichever governments are willing to support. And again, here, there are many other allies who are campaigning on a long-term basis with a much more strategy and long-term vision with respective governments. Like, of course, IFGIA, we worked with them for a long time, so they are, for example, one of the first to also start talking with the Danish government, right, for example, to support this kind of an idea so that we have a different status and not as NGOs, and we can have more direct role in decision making within the UN system, for example. Yes, in spite of all those challenges, I cannot really underrate the importance of solidarity and alliance building, and it has really worked for us in many ways.
Thanks, Cam. Yes. Oh. Yes, Naya, what you describe is really a foundational way of seeing the world and solidarity in what you described. And I think, again, your example of the UN and this structural change, if it's able to come about, is again a similarly foundational piece to completely reframe how you're understanding the nature of the conversations. So I was wondering if you wanted to say another word on solidarity.
Thank you. I have problems, I think, using the word solidarity, but because 40 years ago, government used it every day in different campaigns. It's very related to government. So I prefer to use reciprocity because it's our way of understand solidarity. I think we have many different words and reflections on that. So my experience is more related to communities, the solidarity between communities and between assemblies. In my region there are many assemblies, and we have our local system of self-government. So we are trying to understand the logic of the system of NGOs. Are very something like very far from our reality. For example, we are defending spring in my community, and Mije women of my community are trying to establish, or we're trying to establish a reciprocal relationship with women of another communities. And then suddenly different NGOs appear in our town, and they explained to us about our rights and the UN. And women of my town was like, aware, like, what's about the UN? What's UN? So I think that in our history we have evidence how reciprocity is an important tool to face our problems and to face a climate crisis and expoliation, colonialism, and extractivism. In Oaxaca, in another town, a mining company established in town, and women faced the challenge, that project. But they told me about the importance of reciprocity with the poorest people in the cities or in the world. And since the 10% of the population produces only 50% of greenhouse gases, so the 50% of the world's population produces only 10% of these gases. So the poorest people, I think, is the natural, or the poorest communities in the world, and the natural allies in this fight. But I am very interested in the UN and indigenous rights, but I am trying to translate that kind of language into my language and my context, because when we were fighting for our spring, we had to establish a negotiation with government, and the elders of my community started to explain what water and spring is for us as Mije people, trying to explain that the water is sacred, that is the blood of the earth, and the government it was like boring. But when we start to speak about rights, the human right to water, or okay, we can understand that. So we need to translate our vision of world, our cosmovision, into rights, into law language. So I think it's important to create bridges, to build bridges between UN, NGOs, and local communities, because I think there is a big gap between them, and I think maybe we can start to speak about reciprocity, because climate crisis will be hit everyone. But the poorest people of the world will be the hardest hit by this crisis. So we need to reframe our knowledge, our strategies, on establish partnership and alliance. And I think it's the alliance of the poorest people in the world. I think it's very important. Trying to translate the language of NGOs and rights and UN into our local languages.
Thank you. I love reciprocity as a concept because it requires relationship and it requires deep respect across.
And without hierarchy.
And without hierarchy. So just thank you everyone for your engagement, for your questions, for your participation. A huge round of applause and thank you.